Right. Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are dealing with the English literature paper on literature from 1590 to 1798, and we are doing the unit on Andrew Marvell, one of the most celebrated poets of English literature. I am Anna Kurian and I teach at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. We shall be studying two poems by Andrew Marvell, To His Coy Mistress in considerable detail, and just a brief overview of the second poem, an Horatian Ode. Let us begin with looking at Andrew Marvell's life and times. Andrew Marvell was born in 1621 near Hull, and Hull remains central to a lot of the things that he does and the work that he wrote. So he was educated at Hull Grammar School and at Trinity College, Cambridge. And after that, for a longish period of time, he disappeared. As in, during the English Civil War, he was not available in England and instead he was traveling upon the continent. Supposedly, he also during this period gained familiarity with lots of the European languages and he became a well-traveled citizen of the world. His eclectic personality and his wide-ranging interests are also seen to have drawn from the period 1642 to 1646. During this period, or before this period, he had already shown some evidence of his poetic talent, and he wrote poetry in Greek and Latin addressed to the king. Now, what we will therefore understand is that he also has some royalist sympathies during this period. But of course, because he disappears during the Civil War, we cannot really be certain as to what is exactly happening. Once he comes back, he acted as tutor to Mary Fairfax, the daughter of Thomas Fairfax, and he wrote poetry as he stayed in Appleton House. Nun Appleton House is where he stayed for those years when he was tutor to Mary Fairfax, and during that period is when he writes some of his greatest poetry, including most of his love lyrics, including the celebrated one which we are studying today, as well as the poem Upon Appleton House, which is seen as one of the big country house poems of the period, in a tradition which includes Ben Jonson, Thomas Carew, as well as Amelia Lanier. He wrote a Horatian Ode, one of the greatest political poems in English. Interesting because by then his sympathies are seen to have switched to Cromwell, and also interesting because during that period, when he writes the Horatian Ode, you cannot really be certain as to which side his sympathies lie with, whether they are royalist or whether they are with the Puritan Commonwealth people. He also was a good friend of John Milton, and this again becomes interesting both in terms of the personal as well as in terms of the poetical, because he was a good friend of Milton, befriended him, and Milton helps him to become Latin secretary in the Council of State. Later on, he helps Milton reciprocally. So both of them then share a relationship which transcends their political leanings, affiliations, and becomes something more. He also was, and this again is significant, that somebody who was earlier a royalist sympathizer writing poetry to the king, now of course becomes tutor to William Dutton, the ward of Cromwell, and travels the continent with him. And here again you see him traveling the continent, a continent which he has traveled upon earlier when the Civil War was raging back at home. So all that experience stands him in good stead during this period. Then, of course, later on, he becomes Member of Parliament for his own little township next to his home where he was born, Kingston upon Hull. And he continues then to have a fairly significant political role as well as a literary role in England till the end of his life. He writes his satirical lyrics, he writes other poetry of the time, and he writes political satire in prose. And interestingly, Marvell was also somebody who, once again, recommended tolerance rather than inimical attitude towards anybody who was seen as a dissenter. So in 1672, then, he composed the Rehearsal Transposed, which was supposed to be advocating tolerance towards dissenters rather than a more angry attitude. Finally, of course, we have in 1681 his miscellaneous poems being published posthumously. Interesting because they're published by somebody who calls herself Mary Marvell and claims to be his wife, but actually is only his housekeeper. Now, these are some of those trivia details which make Marvell an interesting figure. And dies in 1678, is today recognized and known mainly for, at least to undergraduate and graduate students, known mainly for To His Coy Mistress, which is the most celebrated Carpe Diem poem of its time. He's also known to a lesser degree for Upon Appleton House, which is a poem in the country house tradition, and a Horatian Ode, which is one of the few political poems which are still well known in English literature. Now, Marvell is also seen to belong to the metaphysical school of English poetry, which flourished during, of course, the 17th century. Now, it is a school which has its beginnings in John Donne's work, and we already have done a unit on John Donne, and we have some clue as to what the metaphysicals were all about. Now, the metaphysicals, to give a brief overview, were people who wrote poetry in which there was passion, but there was also a very strong streak of intelligence and rationality. So they did not believe in writing sentimental verse. Instead, they wrote intelligent verse in which they, of course, gave vent to their passions, but they gave vent to their passions in intellectual fashion because they drew similes, metaphors, images from a range of knowledge which they possessed. So it was also basically an exhibition of knowledge. Now, the metaphysicals were called as such because they used metaphysical conceits. Conceits are nothing other than images, and these images were supposed to yoke together disparate ideas with violence. And what they did was, and an example from Donne will clarify this, compare two lovers to the legs of a compass, that one remains still, one wanders around. So things like that comparisons which were drawn from science, from travel, from geography, from religion, of course, these were the comparisons which worked. So even if they were writing love poetry, their images, their similes, their metaphors were drawn from knowledge which was circulating during that period in England. Now, Marvell fits right into this tradition of metaphysical poets. And we see his verse, which has very strong feeling, which has a lot of passion, but which also has a very strong streak of intelligence and intellectual acumen going through it. So there is none of this feeble sentimentality or emotionalism. Instead, what we have is an intellectual range which demonstrates the range of knowledge that they possessed. In the 19th century, Andrew Marvell was preferred in America rather than in England. And you have various critics who wrote about him in the late 19th century, though there wasn't much. He was seen as being slightly not quite proper. And so people tended to look upon him, as well as some of the other metaphysicals, including John Donne's non-religious love poetry, with some disdain because they saw them as being a little towards the sexually improper and sexually explicit as well. But there is a rehabilitation of the metaphysicals which comes about with the two major works of criticism in the 20th century. One is, of course, T.S. Eliot, who works on the metaphysicals, and the other one is Grierson. Between the two of them, they rehabilitate the metaphysicals. They claim that there is more worth in the metaphysicals than there has been in many of the other poets before or after. And they make of the metaphysicals one of the central groups of English poetry ever in the long stream that literature has in English. So when we look at Andrew Marvell, then we are looking at somebody who is, in his own period, was seen as famous, was seen as accomplished, was seen, however, not just as somebody who had a great role in the world of literature, but also somebody who had a great role in politics. And later on falls into disfavor, kind of disappears, though people still read him, until we come once again to the 20th century where we see him as once again becoming somebody significant. In fact, now it would be difficult to find or pick up any anthology of English poetry which did not have at least one poem by Andrew Marvell, usually, of course, To His Coy Mistress, which is what we will be doing today in some detail. We begin, of course, with the first part of the poem, and we will read it aloud. To His Coy Mistress. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest, an age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. Now, when we look at this poem, we are looking at something which is, of course, in the Carpe Diem tradition, and we will talk a little bit about the Carpe Diem tradition once we've gone through the whole poem. But we also are talking in terms of a dramatic monologue, where the second person who is being addressed, you can only guess at what he or she is saying or doing from the comments that the speaker, who is the poem speaker, says. We also have in this poem the use of course, hyperboles, especially in the stanza that we have just read. And we also see in the first stanza the construction which begins the poem, that had we but world enough and time, if only. It's what he begins with. Now, what the poem does in these first two stanzas is tell us that there is a lover who is talking to his lady love, and he tells her that if only there was time, we could do so many things. And what are these so many things? He says you could go on and on saying no. You could go on refusing me. I would, of course, spend all my time adoring you and being complimentary to you, and eventually you might then one day submit to my adoration. What he also says is that had we but world enough and time. So we are thinking in terms of a space and time continuum here, that the world is not large enough, time is not large enough to contain this. And as he says, this coyness, the coyness that is being depicted by the lady love, would not be a crime if there was that kind of time. But is there that kind of time? Then, of course, you have one of those images coming in here, one of those metaphysical conceits, because he says, thou, by the Indian Ganges side, should rubies find. I, by the tide of Humber, would complain. He brings in an image there which shows us the two extremes. One, he's gone to the Indian Ganges side where he's talking about finding rubies. Now, we have to remember that when he writes this poem, in the first part of the 16th century, we are talking of a period when the embassy has already come to India. They are familiar with Indian territory. So you have Thomas Roe and you have Edward Terry, all of them who went back home and wrote lots of accounts of the time that they spent in India. So when he talks about the Indian Ganges and finding rubies over there, he's indicating also a range of knowledge that he possesses. But, and this is something that's interesting, it is the woman who goes to India in the poem. He himself stays in Humber in England. So the woman is the one who travels out of England. And this is something which is startling, because usually what you see in a lot of the poetry as well as any of the writing during this period is that the women are depicted as being stay-at-home. But in Marvell's poem, she is the one who will go to India, and there she will find rubies, whereas he will stay at home by the side of the river Humber. And there, what would he do? She is finding rubies. She is doing exploration. She is doing the gathering of wealth. He is sitting at home and complaining. So he reverses the roles of man and woman, where the woman, instead of staying at home and complaining because the guy has gone away, here it is the guy who stays at home and complains because the woman has gone and is busy gathering wealth and riches in faraway India. He, of course, continues by saying that if they had that kind of world and time, his vegetable love would grow vaster than empires and more slow. And this, again, is something which has come in for a lot of critical attention from critics through the years. What does he mean when he talks about vegetable love? Now, vegetable love is not something which is therefore animal-like, which does not have life. Instead, it grows like vegetables. They are not alive. They are not animate. Instead, they are inanimate. They just grow automatically. Thus also would his love grow. It would grow vaster than empires and more slow. Again, a gesture towards the fact that England is exploring the idea of expanding its empire, that it'll happen, though it might happen slowly. And then, of course, you have the hyperbole, which is how much time he would spend adoring each part of his coy mistress, that he will spend hours and hours and years and years. He talks about 100 years, 30,000 years, 200 years. Right? He gives us time frames. And that is all that would happen if they had world enough and time. It concludes, the first stanza of the poem, it concludes with 2 lines where he says, "For lady, you deserve the state, nor would I love at lower rate." Now, that she deserves this state, he's paying her, of course, a compliment, saying that you deserve to be loved like this. Through the centuries, through time, that you should be loved and loved and loved, until finally, of course, you will submit to me. But he says, nor would I love at lower rate, which then presents him as this courtly lover who is willing to spend hours and days and years loving his beloved until such time as she is willing to submit to his love for him. But at my back, I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, this is the second stanza of To His Coy Mistress, and if in the first stanza we looked at large swaths of time, thousands of years, in the second stanza we have very limited time. He is talking about time as ruled by death, that sooner or later everybody is going to die and you will be in your grave, and in the grave there will be no sound, no music. Instead, what will there be? There will be worms which will be busy eating you up. Now, even as he says all of this, we also have to remember that the first stanza began with, had we but world enough and time, if only we had world enough and time. The second stanza begins with, but. So what he's saying is, if we had that kind of time, if we had that kind of space, we could have done all those things. But, and that but introduces to us the notion of mortality, that this is it. All life is ruled by death. And given that all life is ruled by death, there is very little that we can do. So when he says, but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, what we are also talking about is the fact that time comes closer and closer and closer, and eventually it cuts the string of life, so that there is death then happening. And as he says, from behind comes time, and in front of us there is only vast eternity. And yet, that vast eternity is not an eternity where there is life. Instead, it is an eternity where there is death and a desert. It is emptiness. So we are looking at a future which is only empty. And at the back, you can hear time hurrying near, winged chariots coming closer and closer. And so the picture that is conjured up is somebody who is standing there caught between an eternity where nothing can happen and a chariot which is coming closer to snip the threads of life that connect him to this life and to his loved one as well. Now, also over here, you have a set of descriptions which are seen to be very interesting because they focus upon death and what happens in the afterlife. But also, it becomes an image then of what could have happened if only they had lived. So when he talks about, in the marble vault shall sound my echoing song, he is talking about the fact that she'll be buried in a marble vault, in a marble tomb, and there will be no music, no song, no sound. There will be nobody to sing love songs to her. So he is then casting her in the role of somebody who has died, still a virgin, still unchecked, untested by a man, and he is the one who, during her lifetime, he sang love songs to her, but his song will not be sounded anymore in her marble vault, in her tomb. And of course, he goes on to say, and this is the crucial line which lots of people had major objections to, then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity. So the virginity which she was so reluctant to yield up to him will instead be gifted to worms. And this was seen as objectionable, that worms should be the ones who should enjoy that virginity. So the physical pleasure which he is asking for is something that the worms derive from her rather than that she gifts to any man in her lifetime. And he calls her honor quaint. Your quaint honor turned to dust and into ashes all my lust. If you look at it, till this point in time, it has only been her who has died, who is in the vault, who's being tested by worms, and so on and so forth. But in this final line, he comes to the fact that even his lust will turn into ashes because she is dead and gone. And then he concludes the stanza with the 2 lines which says, the grave's a fine and private place. Because if you think about it, he is asking for a fine and private place where they can embrace. But he says, The graves are fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. So he's offering her this session of lovemaking where she should give up her virginity to him, but he's also reminding her that if she doesn't, then this is what awaits you. The future is one where there is darkness, there is death, time's winged chariot will come and take you away, and then worms will get you. And you will not be able to listen to my song. There will be no embraces. All my lust will turn to ashes. And eventually there will be only death and nothing else. Emptiness is what will greet you in your afterlife. And then, of course, he proceeds to ask her. Now he comes to the crux of the matter. So if we began with, if only we had so much time, and then he said, but we don't have, so this is what is going to happen. And then he says, therefore, and he says, in that last line, as the last stanza, he begins with, now therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while this willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour, than languish in his slow chapar. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. So now he comes to what he wants. So we don't have time, you will anyway die, I'll also die. So therefore, what should we do? Let's make love. That's basically what the whole poem is about. And yet, the way he puts it is so interesting that it looks like great poetry. We can also then understand why so many people objected to reading this. And they said that it should not circulate. This is not a poem that is like noble, or it does not have sentiments which should be circulating in the common world. So therefore, then, he goes on to say in this final section that we need to get together, we need to make love while we are still young. And he has those sentences which are very crucial, because he talks about while the youthful hue sits on their skin like morning dew. So you're basically in the prime of your life is when you should enjoy life, not wait till you are dead and gone before you start thinking about it. And as he says, while their willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, we are being given a picture not just of youth, but of youth which is fiery, which is full of life, which is then ready to burn. And he says, let us sport us while we may, like amorous birds of prey. And it's a difficult image, because a bird of prey is something that kills. And yet he calls them amorous birds of prey, loving birds of prey. So birds of prey which will then maybe tear at each other, and rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow chapar. If you look at it, in that final stanza, what he also does is the time that he has in the first stanza said that there is so much time which is available to the lovers. In the second stanza, he says time will be the victor. Here he says, if we do what we should be doing as young people, then we will not be in time's power. Instead, we will be able to destroy time. So it's also then this poem is not just about just making love and let's go to bed together kind of thing, but rather it is also about how is it that you can defeat time. And when he talks in that last stanza about rather at once our time devour, then languish in his slow chap power, like power, time is then being imaged as something which has big jaws and it is grinding us down into small powder kind of thing. Instead of that, we can eat up power. Eat up time ourselves. We can devour time. And then he says, finally, we roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball. And this is supposed to be indicating the fact that the fruit of lovemaking is a baby, which will then, of course, also indicate perpetuity. You live on not because you have eternal life, but because you have children. And the children are the ones in whom you live on. So you roll your strength and your sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. So the iron gates of life are the gates which forbid all pleasure, all eternal joy, all that life can hold for you. So instead, by indulging in love, it is possible to live on. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Time, of course, will not stop. Whether you make love or you don't make love, time will still continue. But the fury of their lovemaking can be such that they will then be able to defeat time rather than be in time's power. Now, there is a lot, of course, of funny lines, witty lines, extremely intelligent poetry over here. And yet that intelligence is not also this kind of cold intellectual intelligence. Instead, there is imagination, there is power, there is passion, there is, of course, humor, there is funny laughter and smile, especially in the one where he talks about worms trying people's virginity and so on and so forth. You can laugh at all of this. And therefore, this poem is seen as a perfect example of his wit and his delicacy. This, of course, is problematic because a lot of people did not think of it as being delicate enough. They thought it was too outright open in what it was doing. And so they had problems with the poem. But lots of other critics such as Craig, such as, of course, T.S. Eliot, who appreciated it to the point where he uses lines from To His Coy Mistress, or he uses references to His Coy Mistress in both Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock as well as The Wasteland. So what we see is a poem which has divided critical opinion, or had divided critical opinion till the beginning of the 20th century, where there were a bunch of people who were solidly against the poem, and then there were some who thought that it was some of the best writing that had ever emerged. Now, at this point, it's also necessary to think about how it fits into the tradition of the Carpe Diem. Now, the Carpe Diem as a tradition works with the idea that time is short, therefore one must seize the day. Carpe diem literally meaning seize the day. So when they talk about seizing the day, what we are talking about is making the most of the time we have. So Carpe Diem poems, usually written as exhortations to a young woman or lots of women to enjoy their life while they can. So you have famous examples such as John Donne's The Flea, you have Robert Herrick's To the Virgins to Make Much of Time, To the Virgins to Gather Rosebuds While You May, and so on and so forth. Now, all of these poems have certain themes which are common. Some of them include the insistence that time will, of course, destroy you. So that you see as well over here. All of them, or most of them, have references to the sun as indicating time. So the sun is not seen as something which is friendly to human life and endeavor, but rather is seen as indicating the progression of time, and that the sun will set and all life will end. So you have that. Then, of course, and this is something which this poem also does, there is usually a reference to women's honor. And that's interesting because these poems are gendered poems in the sense that it's always a guy who's doing the talking. So they don't really care about a woman's honor. So when the woman says no and steps back from this whole idea that let us go to bed or let us make love or whatever, they don't appreciate that. Instead, what they say is your honor is really irrelevant. So when we look at a poem like this, and if you look at it, Andrew Marvell is saying the same thing. He says, your quaint honor will turn to dust. What does it matter? Your honor is irrelevant, right? It will turn to dust. So these are then poems which advocate a certain line of action for all women. But that line of action is not necessarily something which would lead to any of them finding happiness ever after. Because also these are not poems which are saying that let's get married and then let's make love. It's just let's make love. So there is this leap which is being made. And when you think about the fact that these were being written in the 17th century, when you think about the fact that these were written in an age of, at least outwardly, people were careful about things like chastity and virginity and remaining true and loyal and so on and so forth. Then a poem like this, or all the Carpe Diem poems which advocate making love irrespective of marriage or outside of marriage, they become curious because they're telling us about a different idea which is there in society, which shows us men deciding what is best for young women, or trying to say that this is what is best, that they should live their lives, enjoy themselves, and it doesn't matter what happens to their honor and their respectability. So finally then, when we look at Coy Mistress, we are looking at a poem wherein there is a certain amount of initially a certain amount of indulging of the woman, where she's being told that, I will hold off and I will talk to you and I will woo you and I will woo you and I will woo you. And then finally, he says, there is no time because at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot drawing near. And Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland is what the title of the second poem is. And it was written to celebrate his triumphant return, Oliver Cromwell's triumphant return after conquering Ireland in 1650. Now, it's also important to know that Cromwell is somebody who is seen as having headed to a great extent the civil war against royalty, the Stuarts, in England during the first half of the century. And he is the one who is also responsible for the execution of King Charles I. And therefore, then, when we look at Cromwell, we are looking at a figure who is victorious and who heads the Commonwealth after the execution of the king. He heads the Commonwealth in England until his death in the late 1950s. Now, we are also looking at a religious figure because Cromwell heads the Roundheads or the Puritan Party. And the Puritan Party, one of the reasons why they fought against the Royalists, apart from reasons, political reasons, is also because of religion. That they believed in a version of religion which they did not find appreciated by Charles I or by the Stuarts or by the court. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why the Royalists and the Party of the Commonwealth fought and why the Commonwealth took over the ruling of England during the 1650s. And therefore then, what we are looking at when we read this poem is a poem written by a poet who dabbled in politics and who is writing about the return of Cromwell triumphantly and the execution of Charles I. So it would seem to be difficult to reconcile these two. You obviously have to present Charles I as a villain if you are going to exalt Cromwell. And yet Marvell manages to do both. He does not present him as a villain. He presents Charles I as somebody who is dignified even as he is being taken to his death. And he presents Cromwell not as an autocratic tyrant who is out to kill the royal king, but as somebody who is doing what is right and what is good for the kingdom and for the people whom he supports. So he actually manages a very difficult balancing act over here. The ode, which is the style in which the poem is written, which is the form in which the poem is written, is a lyric form and is usually devoted to praising an event, an object, a person, etc. And it uses a regular stanza pattern. And we see over here within this text that it's a fairly long poem. And what Marvell does is he begins with showing us Cromwell returning after the defeat of Ireland as somebody who is both adventurous and who is almost king-like. He is like godlike person. He may not be king-like, but he's definitely godlike. From there, he moves on to showing us the execution of the king, Charles I. And that execution is portrayed for us in terms which show Charles I as somebody who is dignified and who behaves like royalty on the scaffold itself. So he does not call upon God, he does not call down curses upon the people surrounding him, he does not lament his tragic fate. Instead, he bends his head to the executioner's act as if he was going to put his head down upon his bed. And this depiction of the execution of Charles I is seen by a lot of critics as the height of the poem, because what we see there is a depiction which could have been polarizing. Instead, it is seen as respectful, as giving the king the dignity that he deserved, and also, but seen as heralding better times for the English Republic, which were just starting out. And in the course of the poem, Cromwell is compared to Caesar, to Hannibal, several other people. Of course, he is compared to the gods. And we are shown Cromwell as somebody who will then save England from itself. The poem has been appreciated by various critics because of that balanced attitude that Marvell strikes. So what we see, the contents of the poem have been summarized for us, wherein we see him going, of course, and fighting, his violence, his acumen on the battlefield, and so on and so forth. And then finally, you have the king on the scaffold. And the poem ends with attention coming back to Cromwell. Now, after this, what you have is the critical views on the poem. And in this, you have praise of this unresolved attitude that Marvell is able to depict over here with such certainty. So even though Charles was seen by Cromwell and his party as somebody who was in the wrong, over here Marvell is seen respectfully speaking about King Charles. At the same time, he also admires Cromwell. And therefore, what is given as high praise for this poem is the fact that it is best and it is direct. It does not take a stand upon either. But it also does something more, as in it, instead of taking one party's side or the other party's side, it instead demonstrates to us what it would be to look at both parties as equal. So you would then see the point of view which each party had, and in doing so then you reach the poem to an ideal state. So today we have looked at Andrew Marvell, and we have been looking at two of his poems. One, of course, To His Coy Mistress, the most famous of his poetry, the most anthologized of his verses, and also an Horatian Ode, which is written upon the return of Cromwell to Ireland. We have examined the features of Coy Mistress in some detail, and we have done a quick summary of the views on the Horatian Ode as well. Thank you.